Herbert Hoover had proven himself woefully inadequate for the job of president. His volunteerism and individualistic ideas had led to nothing but poverty, famine, mass homeless encampments, and people covering themselves in newspapers known as Hoover blankets in order to keep themselves warm, and turning out empty pockets called Hoover flags. The Democratic alternative in 1932 was a New Deal, championed by New York governor and progressive candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt was attractive and charismatic and spoke right to the people with a charisma that Hoover did not control. Roosevelt had done a good job in cleaning up the Great Depression in New York and was seen as a reformer and a progressive with a great pedigree. He was the cousin of President Teddy Roosevelt, a fellow progressive, and like his cousin, carried the same amount of dynamism and ability to speak. His eloquence and passion rang out in all of his speeches, and crowds came to hear him. He had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I and the vice presidential pick for president for the Democrats in 1920. He had married Teddy Roosevelt's niece and his own cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was given away by Teddy at their wedding. Roosevelt's ascendant star was hampered by a diagnosis of polio in the 1920s, which left him disabled and hardly able to walk. At first he used a cane and later was wheelchair-bound. But this did not stop Roosevelt from overcoming his disability and achieving his dreams. This would not stop him from making a masterful political comeback, and he made one when he was elected governor of New York in 1929. His record handling the economy during the Great Depression in the country's central and largest state made him the automatic choice for the Democrats in 1932. Roosevelt's promises of relieving the Great Depression through his New Deal rang true with the common man, and just like the Democrats a century ago, it brought him into office easily. Roosevelt won against Hoover in a landslide, something that would become quite common during his presidency. Roosevelt was swept into office with huge popularity and many promises to fulfill, and due to careful optics and planning was able to keep his disability a secret while he worked tirelessly to improve the lives of ordinary, everyday Americans. His first 100 days constituted a promise of trying to change as much as he possibly could. He promised work for the workless and food for the hungry, as well as the end to the suffering of those experiencing loss, the downtrodden who had suffered in the Dust Bowl and who were looking tirelessly for a roof over their heads. Roosevelt communicated directly to them, signing executive order after executive order and putting his New Deal into play. He is one of the most active presidents and one of the most communicative and charismatic. Using the newfound radio technology to his advantage, his fireside chats united the nation as people tuned in on a weekly basis to listen to the president, who had promised them new methods of relief and new ways to improve the American economy. His New Deal programs came in two parts. The first New Deal promised new work provided by the government in a series of different programs which came to be known as Roosevelt's Alphabet Soup. This soup included government work programs such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, the National Relief Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the Workers' Progress Administration, all of which served to create infrastructure projects that would provide new jobs for many working people, including building roads, bridges, canals, and providing hydroelectric power. Some of these programs are still in use to this day, continuing to provide relief, recovery, and reform, the 3 R's of Roosevelt's New Deal. The second New Deal provided direct payment to consumers who needed the help. First, Social Security provided senior citizens with money so that they would not go broke if they did not have savings. Unemployment provided workers with means to survive while they looked for new jobs, which was common during the Great Depression for millions of American families and households. Then the FDIC was created in order to provide monetary funds for banks that might go under, preventing future runs on the bank. These programs helped, for sure, but did not end the Great Depression, as many of the work programs Roosevelt created were deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court or were purely temporary, only providing temporary employment for those who needed it. Despite this, Roosevelt's popularity, charisma, and ability to reach the common man, as well as his optimism in the face of danger, made him extremely popular. His ability to talk directly to the American people swelled his popularity, and while many considered him a dictator, many more considered him a hero, having done more in 4 years than most presidents did in 8. Because of this, they reelected him in 1936 and to an unprecedented third and fourth term in 1940 and 1944, as Roosevelt won all elections overwhelmingly, believing he needed to stay to finish the job. Namely, the job was to ensure the 4 freedoms: the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. Roosevelt articulated these views over and over again, and to an American people who had been suffering and literally starving, these freedoms seemed like paradise. Roosevelt's goals seemed to be being met slowly but surely. But only a world conflict could interrupt them, and a world conflict inevitably did. The rise of a German war machine led by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis paraded across Europe in the late 1930s, dividing the continent and plunging it into world war after the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939. By 1940, after the subjugation of France and invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler and his forces seemed unstoppable. Meanwhile, Benito Mussolini and the Italians, another ally of Hitler's, invaded Ethiopia, while the Japanese ran through China and Southeast Asia, undermining and attacking the British. The Japanese were as fierce of fighters as you could get, and Britain stood alone, fighting the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan in Europe, Africa, and Asia, respectively. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union tried to stave off the German invasion. Churchill came to the United States often, begging Roosevelt for help, but Roosevelt believed that America was too much in the doldrums of its own problems to help. Instead, they gave aid to the British as well as the Russians. But the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, forced Roosevelt's hand, declaring war on Japan, which was quickly followed by Germany and Italy declaring war on the United States. And now the president who had guided the country through the Great Depression needed to guide it through a Second World War. And guide it he did, turning to the business interests of the United States by incentivizing the motor and manufacturing industries to produce weapons, arms, and munitions, thus skyrocketing production just in time for the war, as well as providing jobs, mainly for women as men went off to fight. Propaganda campaigns like Rosie the Riveter showed the power that women held when they entered the workforce, and Uncle Sam once again drummed up support for the armed forces by enlisting soldiers to fight and encouraging patriotic Americans to buy war bonds in the time of the country's greatest need so that they could support the government's war efforts. Dutiful patriotic housewives were depicted as rationing supplies so that soldiers could enjoy more goods such as coffee and sugar. It was all seen as a patriotic effort. At the meantime, propaganda demonized the enemy, showing them as subhuman, imperialistic, and dangerous. And the Japanese, due to their racial differences more than anything, were especially targeted and seen as violent aggressors and the enemy. This mistrust and alienation of the Japanese would continue and roll over into Executive Order 9066, signed by Roosevelt, which interred hundreds of thousands of Japanese who were suspected as being spies, more loyal to their emperor than to the United States. They were put in camps in the deserts, their property and possessions stolen, and they lived there for the rest of the war. The real Japanese threat was foreign, not domestic, as the Japanese seized many islands, including the Philippines, and waged a brutal campaign in the Pacific, their naval and aircraft technology clearly being ahead of the United States until the U.S. won a huge victory at the Battle of Midway, and then with the British and Australians began a series of island hopping in which they would retake occupied islands one time at another, facing off against the Japanese in land, air, and sea, and seeing the brutality, savagery, and bravery of the Japanese fighting forces. But slowly but surely, the United States started to turn the tide. Meanwhile, in North Africa, under the leadership of George S. Patton, the American military and tank brigades provided relief to the British, eventually pushing the fight into Italy and forcing the Italians out of the war. Soon after this, in 1944, under the command of Dwight Eisenhower, the Allies landed at Normandy Beach and started to push the Nazis back into France. The D-Day invasions were successful, eventually leading to the Allies liberating Paris and France later in 1944, and the final German offensive of the Bulge in the winter of 1944 and 1945 was unsuccessful. At the same time, the fourth re-election campaign for Roosevelt was successful, and Roosevelt began meeting with Joseph Stalin and the Soviets who were pushing in from the east, as well as Churchill, to reconfigure Europe and the rest of the world after the war. Roosevelt was in declining health, and despite being re-elected and the Allies close to victory, he passed away from a cerebral hemorrhage in April of 1945, 2 weeks before the war ended. As the nation mourned, it also celebrated, with the Germans surrendering and 2 months later the Japanese surrendering due to the use of the atomic bomb created by the Manhattan Project, which Roosevelt had commissioned to use against the Germans at the beginning of the war. Despite his legendary accomplishments, Roosevelt's legacy would continue and his work continue with his wife, Eleanor, who proposed that the United Nations be created as a way to continue to provide world peace and stability. Carrying on her husband's ideas and legacies, she became a founding member in the organization that has preserved the world from a world war for the last 8 decades. Then there is Roosevelt himself, whose legacy as a president stands larger than many others and is often considered one of, if not the greatest American president in the nation's history. Having guided the nation through the Great Depression and then successfully navigated it through World War II, Roosevelt was the president of the greatest generation. And that greatest generation, which would now rebuild the world, had been led by perhaps the greatest president.